Welcome to Fright Fables, where chilling tales keep you company through the night. Before we start, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you're enjoying the journey, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps keep the stories coming. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. We weren't supposed to be out that far. Not that late in the season. Not with that much snow already packed onto the mountain. But we had planned this trip for months, and when we saw the forecast, we told ourselves it wasn't a big deal. Bluebird skies, no fresh powder, avalanche risk was low. So we went. It was just me and Josh, hiking deep in the backcountry, following a route we had scouted in the summer. No trail markers, no other people. Just untouched snow, rolling ridgelines, and the occasional gust of wind whistling through the trees. We had our avalanche beacons, shovels, probes. But, if I'm being honest, we got too comfortable. The sun was already starting to dip when we reached the ridge. The snow beneath us was packed tight, hard like walking on solid ground. We should have turned back then, started heading down before the temperature dropped. But Josh wanted a picture. He stepped a few feet past the edge of the ridge, adjusting his GoPro, leaning forward just slightly. And then I heard the crack, a deep, hollow pop beneath my boots. Then a low rumble. Then nothing. The world just gave out underneath us. I don't remember the fall. Just flashes, Josh shouting my name, tumbling through white, my arms flailing, snow swallowing me whole. A second of silence, then a thud. When I came to, I was half buried. My head was above the snow, but my body was pinned, stuck like a bug in amber. Everything hurt. My breath came out in quick, panicked gasps, steam rising into the freezing air. Josh was next to me, coughing, shaking snow from his jacket. Alive. We had fallen into a ravine. The walls around us were steep, at least 15 feet up, with sheer ice and rock on both sides. The avalanche hadn't been big, just a small slab breaking loose, dumping us into this pit. But there was no way out, no footholds, no easy climb. Josh reached for his radio. I reached for my phone. No signal. Okay, Josh said, exhaling. His breath curled in the air. Okay, we'll dig. We'll dig up and find a way out. He started shifting snow away from his legs, using his gloved hands like a dog burrowing into the ground. I did the same, trying not to panic. That's when I saw it. A hand, frozen, pale, fingers stiff as stone, sticking out of the snow just inches from my boot. I scrambled back. Josh! He looked up, saw what I was staring at, and went dead silent. The skin on the hand was gray, stretched tight over bone, like it had been trapped there for a long time. The nails were black, cracked. It wasn't fresh. Josh swallowed hard. Someone else fell here. My hands were shaking. My face burned from the cold. There was something wrong about the way the hand stuck out. Too stiff, too perfectly placed. Like whoever it belonged to had reached for the surface and never made it. Josh grabbed his shovel and started digging, fast. I watched as more of the arm appeared. Blue jacket, torn at the sleeve. But something in my gut told me to stop. I was about to tell him when I heard it. A voice. Low, distant, echoing through the ravine. My voice. At first I thought it was just the wind, bouncing off the ice walls, twisting the sound of my own breathing into something else. But then Josh's name whispered through the cold like someone standing right behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Then the whisper came again. Josh stopped digging. His face was pale. Dude, tell me you heard that. I heard it. It wasn't us. The whispers came in waves, barely there, like someone was mimicking our own voices, but too slow, too stretched out, like a record player winding down. And then, in a voice that was neither mine nor Josh's, the whisper said, "Help me." The snow around the hand shifted. Josh threw down the shovel. Nope, I'm done. We need to get the hell out of here. I couldn't move. My breath was shallow, heart pounding. Something moved under the ice. The snow between us and the frozen hand shifted again, like something was crawling underneath it. Then I saw it. A shape. A dark, twisting shape, pressing against the ice from beneath, stretching like fingers trying to break through. I bolted, didn't think, didn't plan, just ran. Josh was right behind me, scrambling up the icy walls, clawing for anything to hold on to. I dug my boots into the slope, my hands finding roots, rocks, anything to pull myself up. The whispers grew louder. "Help me. Don't leave." A hand burst from the snow, fingers grasping, reaching. But it wasn't the one we saw before. It was fresh, new. Josh screamed. I kicked at the ice, launched myself over the edge, grabbing the nearest tree branch and yanking myself up onto solid ground. Josh scrambled up beside me, panting, eyes wide. We ran. Didn't stop. Didn't look back. Didn't breathe until we saw our car parked at the trailhead. When we finally turned, the ravine was nothing but an untouched stretch of white. No sign of the avalanche. No sign of the body. No hand. Nothing. Josh didn't speak the entire drive back. I barely slept that night. A week later, I checked the weather reports. There had been a new avalanche in that exact spot, big enough to bury the entire ravine. I don't know what we saw down there. I don't know if we were supposed to find it, but I do know one thing. Sometimes when the wind howls just right outside my window, I still hear my name, whispered back to me, as if it's waiting. You remember how back in the early 2000s and 10s everyone was obsessed with those abandoned exploration videos on YouTube? Like people would just wander into old crumbling buildings, film the whole thing, and somehow get millions of views? I wasn't one of those big creators, but I was around that scene. I'd just moved to Detroit after college, trying to make it as a freelance videographer. I was broke, living in a tiny studio apartment, and desperate for content that could go viral. That's how I ended up at the Static House. I'd heard about it from this guy named Marcus, who ran a local urbex forum. He was one of those guys who knew every abandoned spot in the city, and he'd post cryptic hints about new locations. The Static House was his latest find. He said it was this old Victorian mansion on the outskirts of the city, untouched for decades. The photos he posted were eerie, peeling wallpaper, shattered chandeliers, and this weird, almost unnatural stillness to the place. But what really caught my attention was the name. Marcus said it came from the constant static noise that filled the house, like an old TV left on. No one could figure out where it was coming from. I messaged him immediately, asking for the address. He was hesitant at first, saying the place had a weird vibe, but I convinced him I was serious. I told him I'd credit him in the video, and he finally caved. The address he sent me was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by overgrown woods. Perfect for a creepy exploration video. I packed my gear, camera, tripod, a couple of batteries, and a flashlight, and headed out at dawn. The drive was uneventful, but as I got closer, the GPS started glitching. The screen would flicker, and the voice directions cut in and out with bursts of static. I figured it was just bad signal, but it put me on edge. When I finally found the house, it was exactly like Marcus described. A massive, decaying Victorian with a sagging roof and broken windows. The air around it felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I set up my camera and started recording. The static hit me as soon as I stepped inside. It wasn't loud, but it was everywhere, like the house itself was humming. I tried to ignore it and focus on the visuals. The cracked mirrors, the dusty furniture, the strange symbols carved into the walls. But the static kept pulling me back. It wasn't just noise. It felt alive, like it was watching me. I made my way to the second floor, where the static got louder. There was a door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. I pushed it open and found a room filled with old TVs. They were all different sizes, some from the 50s, others from the 80s, all stacked haphazardly on top of each other. And they were all on, playing nothing but static. My camera started glitching, the screen flickering with the same static as the TVs. I tried to shut it off, but it wouldn't respond. That's when I noticed something in the static, shapes moving just beneath the surface. At first I thought it was my imagination, but then I saw a face. It was blurry, distorted, but unmistakably human, and it was looking right at me. I bolted. I didn't even grab my tripod. I just ran out of the house, jumped in my car, and drove until the static faded. When I got home, I checked the footage. The first half was fine, but everything after I entered the TV room was corrupted. The file was just gone. I tried to tell myself it was a technical glitch, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. A few days later, I got a message from Marcus. He asked how the exploration went, and I told him everything. He didn't respond for a long time. When he finally did, all he said was, "You shouldn't have gone in there." I tried to ask him what he meant, but he blocked me. I never heard from him again. The weirdest part? A week after that, I started hearing the static. It's faint, like a whisper, but it's always there, no matter where I am. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I see those shapes again, moving just out of sight. I don't know what I brought back from the static house, but I think it's still with me. I'm not a big fan of backcountry snowboarding. Sure, it's got that whole freedom vibe, but there's too much that can go wrong. But my friends, they're all about it. So when they dragged me along for a weekend of epic powder, I figured I'd go along. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. It started out fine. Blue skies, fresh snow, untouched trails. We hiked for what felt like hours to get to this hidden ridge, dropping into a bowl that was so pristine it looked like no one had ever set foot there. It was beautiful, until it wasn't. It was the third run of the day when we saw it. We were cutting through this tree line, trying to stay ahead of the setting sun. Jake was ahead, always the first to drop, yelling about how we'd never find snow like this again. Then he just stopped. "Yo, Jake, what's the holdup?" I called out, thinking he'd probably spotted some gnarly drop he wanted us to hit. But when I caught up, he wasn't looking at the trail. He was staring off to the side toward this small clearing. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it. There, half buried in the snow, was a person. At least I thought it was. They were so still, perfectly still. Their gear was ancient, like 80s neon. You know the kind of stuff you see in vintage ads? A cracked snowboard was sticking out of the snow nearby, the binding snapped clean off. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, his voice shaky. Is that a body?" I asked, my stomach flipping. We didn't get too close at first. I mean, what if it was fresh? What if there was a freak avalanche or something? But the more we stared, the more we realized something was off. The figure wasn't just frozen, it was preserved, like they'd been sitting there for years, but the snow hadn't touched them. Their goggles were perfectly clear, and their face, though pale and stiff, looked almost lifelike. Too lifelike. "We need to call someone," Sarah said, finally breaking the silence. She had her phone out, but of course we were too deep in the mountains for any kind of signal. Jake, always the idiot, thought we should check for a wallet or ID. "Dude, what if they've been missing for years? We could help the family, you know?" "Jake, don't," I snapped, but he was already stepping closer. As he got within a few feet, there was this sound, like ice cracking, sharp and sudden. We all froze. Jake stopped dead in his tracks, his breath visible in the cold air. Did that come from them?" Sarah whispered. I didn't want to believe it, but it sounded like the noise came from the figure. Jake backed up fast, and we all agreed to leave it alone and head back to report it. But as we turned to leave, I swear, I saw the faintest flicker of movement, just the smallest twitch of a finger. I told myself it was the wind, or my mind playing tricks. But it didn't feel like a trick. We made it back to the parking lot, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. We flagged down a ranger and told them everything. He radioed for backup and said they'd send a team up first thing in the morning. The night was restless. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the snow. The way their goggles seemed to reflect the light even though there wasn't any, the eerie stillness, and that sound. The next morning we rode back up with the search team. They were all business, ropes, sleds, first aid kits. We led them to the spot, but when we got there, the clearing was empty. No body, no gear, nothing. "Are you sure this is the spot?" one of the rangers asked, giving us this skeptical look. "Yes, it was right here." The snowboard was sticking out of the snow. Bright green, cracked in half, Sarah insisted, her voice shaking. But the snow was untouched, pristine, no sign of anyone ever being there. The rangers shrugged it off as a mistake, maybe a shadow or drift we misinterpreted in the fading light. But as we turned to leave, I spotted something half hidden under a tree nearby, a piece of bright green plastic. I didn't say anything, just quietly picked it up and stuffed it into my pocket. When we got back to the car, I pulled it out to show the others. It was a shard of the broken snowboard, the same neon green we'd seen sticking out of the snow. Nobody said a word the whole ride home, but that night, as I lay in bed, I swore I heard that same cracking sound outside my window. Winter camping isn't for everyone. It's cold, isolated, and the silence can be almost suffocating. But for me, that's always been part of the appeal. A chance to disconnect from the chaos of life and just exist in the stillness of nature. At least, that's how I used to feel. I was camping alone in a remote area of Montana last January, miles from any trailhead, the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another person. The snow was deep, the air crisp, and the solitude absolute. I'd set up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by dense evergreens, with a frozen creek running nearby. It was perfect, or so I thought. On my second day, while exploring the area, I stumbled across an old cabin. It was tucked away in the woods, almost hidden by the thick trees and heavy snow. The wood was weathered, and the roof sagged under the weight of the snow, but smoke was faintly rising from the chimney. I hesitated. Cabins like this weren't uncommon in the wilderness, but I hadn't seen anyone else around. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it out. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the scent of burnt wood. A fire smoldered in a stone fireplace, and scattered around the single room were signs that someone had been there recently. Half-empty cans of food, a tattered sleeping bag, and a mug still sitting on a makeshift table. But what caught my attention, what made my stomach tighten, were the photographs. They were everywhere, pinned to the walls, stacked on the table, even scattered across the floor. Each one was of a person staring directly at the camera with an unsettlingly wide smile. There were men, women, children, all smiling that same frozen, unnatural smile. The photos were old, yellowed around the edges, but some looked recent, the faces stark and clear against the aged paper. I felt a chill creep up my spine, unrelated to the cold outside. I told myself it was just weird, not dangerous. Maybe someone with a hobby for photography, or a strange sense of decoration. But something about those smiles didn't sit right with me. They were too forced, too hollow. I didn't stick around long. The place felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I left quickly, trudging back through the snow to my campsite, my breath fogging up in the freezing air. The forest seemed quieter than before, the usual sounds of creaking branches and distant animal calls eerily absent. Back at my tent, I tried to shake off the unease. I made myself a quick meal, sat by the fire, and convinced myself I was overreacting. People lived off the grid all the time. The cabin was probably just some hermit's home. The photos, maybe they were family, friends. It didn't mean anything sinister. But then I saw the footprints. They were fresh, pressed deep into the snow, leading straight to my campsite and stopping just a few feet from my tent. My blood ran cold as I followed them with my eyes, realizing they came from the direction of the cabin. They weren't mine. I hadn't gone that way since returning. Someone had followed me. I stood frozen, my breath hitching in my throat. My eyes darted to the tree line, scanning the shadows for any movement. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the silence pressing in on me like a weight. I grabbed my hatchet from my pack, my fingers trembling as I gripped the handle. The footprints circled my tent once before disappearing back into the woods. I couldn't see where they ended. They just vanished into the darkness. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the idea of trekking through the snow at night knowing someone might be out there watching me was almost worse. I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire all night, my back to the tent, the hatchet resting on my knee. Every rustle of the trees, every gust of wind made my heart race. I kept expecting to see someone step out of the shadows, that frozen smile stretched across their face. When dawn finally broke, I wasted no time. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started back toward the trailhead. The whole way, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the forest remained empty, eerily still. It wasn't until I got home that I realized the full extent of what had happened. As I was unpacking my gear, I found something stuffed into one of my side pockets, a photograph. It was me, sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, and I was smiling. That's when I knew. Whoever was out there, they weren't just watching. They'd been close enough to take the picture, close enough to leave it behind. I don't know what they wanted, but I haven't been back to the woods since. There's an old storage facility on the outskirts of town, one of those places where people abandon their past. Foreclosed businesses, bankrupt dreams, things people left behind and never came back for. That's where he found the film. A guy named Mark, local indie filmmaker, always looking for weird, forgotten relics for inspiration. He'd been working on a horror short and wanted something real. Authentic vintage props, not the digital filters everyone fakes nowadays. That's how he ended up at Lot 86. The guy who ran the storage place let him dig through an old unit. Some studios lost inventory, untouched since the 70s. Mark found a box of dusty film reels buried under broken lighting rigs and script pages from dead projects. Most were nothing special, but one had no label, just a date written in shaky red marker. 1967. No title, no studio name, no other markings. Just that year. Of course, Mark took it home. That's where he fucked up. He had an old film projector, something he picked up at a flea market years ago. It was janky, but still worked. He set it up, loaded the reel, and let it play against the blank wall of his apartment. At first, it was just static, then a flicker, a room, completely empty. Gray walls, concrete floors, a single wooden chair in the center. The film looked like security footage. No sound, just a low, humming white noise. The footage cut, jumping to another angle of the same room, slightly closer, then another. Mark waited for someone to appear. Nothing did. Just cuts, slow zooms, an empty chair. 10 minutes in, he almost turned it off. But right before he reached for the projector, the camera moved. It wasn't a cut this time. The shot shifted, turning slightly, like someone behind the camera was watching. Mark told himself he imagined it, but the next night he had to check. He played the reel again, watching closely. Same static, same empty room, same slow cuts. But something was different. The chair was closer to the camera. Not by much. Maybe a foot. He skipped back to last night's footage. The chair had definitely moved. No doors, no windows, no sign of anyone entering. It was just closer. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Maybe it was some experimental art piece. Maybe the chair was a trick, subliminal movement messing with his brain. Mark played the film again. The room was still empty. The chair was gone. Instead, there was a doorway, not in the film itself. On his wall. A perfect outline of a door, cast by the projector's light. A door that wasn't there before. Mark paused the film, and his breath caught in his throat. Because inside the paused frame, someone was sitting in the chair. He knew he shouldn't keep watching, but Mark couldn't stop. The next night he turned the reel back on, convinced he had to be imagining it. But this time, the film didn't start with static. This time, it started with his living room. The same angle, same lighting, same couch. It was his apartment. He froze. The footage wasn't old anymore. It was now. Mark lifted his hand. The film lifted its hand. Mark stood up. The film stood up. Mark reached for the projector. The figure on the screen turned its head and looked at him. Mark hadn't moved. Nobody knows what happened to Mark after that night. The cops found his apartment a week later after neighbors reported the smell. No signs of a break-in. No signs of him, just the film reel still running in an endless loop. And the last frame ever recorded? An empty chair and a door, wide open. I've been snowboarding for years, but that day on the mountain was the first time I genuinely felt like I might not make it out. It started out as a perfect day. Thick fog hanging low over the peaks, giving everything this eerie, otherworldly vibe. My friends and I had been hitting the backcountry trails all morning, carving fresh powder and loving every second. But then the fog got thicker. You know how they say you can't see 2 feet in front of you? It was like that. The kind of fog that swallows sound and makes everything feel wrong. We were heading toward the tree line when I realized I'd lost sight of the group. I figured they'd just gone ahead. No big deal. I'd catch up. I shouted their names a couple of times, but my voice sounded weird in the fog, muffled and distant like it didn't belong to me. That's when I heard it, a whistle, short and sharp, cutting through the silence like a lifeline. At first, I thought it was one of my friends, maybe trying to guide me back. So I called out, "Hey, wait up," and started heading in the direction of the sound. The fog made everything feel closer than it was. I'd hear the whistle, move toward it, and then hear it again further away. It was like playing a game of Marco Polo with someone who didn't want to be found. After about 10 minutes, I realized I wasn't anywhere near the trails. The trees around me were massive, ancient, their branches twisting together overhead like a net. The snow was untouched, no tracks anywhere but my own. Then I heard the whistle again, closer this time. It sounded different, like it wasn't coming from someone blowing a whistle, but more like the sound was alive. It didn't rise and fall naturally. It just hung in the air, sharp and shrill, like it was echoing from inside my head. I yelled, "Who's there?" But no one answered. Just another whistle, a little louder, a little more insistent. I'll admit it. I started to panic. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees felt like they were closing in, the branches reaching down like fingers. Every time I thought I was heading in the right direction, the whistle would change, pulling me further in. And then I saw them. Tracks. Fresh snowboard tracks, cutting cleanly through the powder. Relief hit me like a wave. I wasn't alone after all. I followed them, hoping they'd lead me back to the trail or my friends. But as I got closer, something about the tracks didn't sit right. They were my tracks, the exact same ones I'd made when I first entered the woods. I knew because of the slight wobble in the turns, the way I'd skidded on a patch of ice. I'd been walking in circles. That's when I saw the footprints. They came out of nowhere, weaving in and out of my snowboard tracks, bare feet in the snow. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whistle came again, this time so loud and clear it felt like it was right behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, just fog and trees. I tried to move, but my legs felt like lead. The whistle came again, and I swear I saw something move between the trees. Not a person exactly, just something. A shadow darker than the fog sliding silently between the trunks. I bolted. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. I stumbled over roots and rocks, the whistle following me the whole time. It never stopped. It didn't even sound like it was chasing me. It sounded like it was inside me, vibrating through my chest and skull. Somehow I broke through the tree line and onto an open slope. The fog was still thick, but I could see the faint outline of a trail marker up ahead. I didn't stop running until I hit the main trail and collapsed in the snow, gasping for air. My friends found me about an hour later, sitting in the snow, shaking like a leaf. I tried to explain what happened, but they just laughed it off. "You probably just got turned around in the fog," one of them said. Happens all the time. But when I looked down at my board, my heart nearly stopped. The bindings were coated in frost except for 2 spots where it had melted clean through. The shape of fingers. I've been riding this mountain since I was 15. I know every run, every hidden powder stash, every shortcut through the trees. I thought I knew everything about this place, but that night, I realized I didn't know shit. We were the last ones up. Me, Matt, Trevor, and Riley. It was a late-season night ride, the kind where the air is thick with cold and the snow glows blue under the floodlights. The mountain was empty except for us, and maybe a few stragglers finishing their runs. We caught the last lift just before close, the kind of dumb luck that makes you feel invincible. I wish we had missed it. The chairs swayed as we climbed, creaking over the frozen cables. Below us, the floodlights dotted the mountain, casting pools of pale yellow onto the empty slopes. The village at the base was already winding down, the lodge windows glowing against the dark. Then, the lift jerked to a stop. Matt, sitting next to me, groaned. Ugh, here we go. Trevor, 2 chairs ahead, laughed. They probably shut it down early on accident. Give it a sec. I adjusted my gloves and sat back. No big deal. Happens all the time. Just some lifty messing with controls, about to get reamed by his manager. But then the lights cut out. The entire mountain went black. Just the wind, the creak of the cables, and us. What the hell? Riley muttered. I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket, but the screen was useless, no signal. A long minute passed, then another. Matt clicked his tongue. Okay, this is officially weird. Trevor twisted in his seat, calling toward us. Yo, think we can climb down? It's not that far. Nope, I shot back. Unless you want to break a leg in the dark. Another minute. And then Riley, sitting on the end, froze. What the? His voice was barely a whisper. He was staring at the nearest lift tower, at the ladder. I followed his gaze, my stomach clenched. Footprints, leading up the rungs of the service ladder, but not back down. A sharp gust of wind hit us, making the chair sway. I couldn't pull my eyes from those prints. Riley whispered, "Do you guys see anyone in the tower?" No one answered, because none of us wanted to look. Trevor finally let out a nervous chuckle. Okay. Someone's just working on it, right? That's a thing, right? Then where the hell is he? Matt shot back. Another gust of wind I swallowed, stomach turning to ice. Okay, seriously, where's the ski patrol? And then we heard it. A thud. Above us. Directly above the lift. The cable shuddered. Riley sucked in a sharp breath. That came from the tower. None of us moved. Another thud. Closer. Something was on the cable, walking toward us. We all pressed back in our seats, gripping the cold metal frame, trying not to breathe too loud. The wind howled through the lift line, but underneath it, I swore I could hear something else. A soft scrape, boots against metal. Trevor whispered, "Dude, what the hell?" The chair ahead of us moved, jerked, hard. Trevor yelped, grabbing the safety bar. That! What was that? Then Matt screamed. I spun. His head was tilted up, staring at something above us, his face pale as snow. I didn't want to look, but I did, and I saw it. A shape crouched on the lift cable, just feet above our chair. The wind howled, and for a split second, I thought maybe, I was imagining it. But then it moved. It shifted forward slow, deliberate. I could make out boots, snow-dusted pants, a heavy coat zipped up to the neck, a ski mask, no goggles, just dark, empty holes where the eyes should have been. Matt let out a strangled breath. What the I grabbed his arm, tight. Don't move. The thing on the cable tilted its head. It was watching us, studying us, like it was waiting. Trevor, still ahead of us, was shaking. What do we do? My mind was racing. We were stuck 30 feet in the air, nowhere to go, nowhere to run. If it jumped onto our chair, the lift creaked, the thing moved, and then the lights came back on. Floodlights blazed to life across the mountain. The lift cable hummed, kicking back to life. I blinked, spots dancing in my vision. The chair lurched forward. The thing was gone. Not on the cable, not in the tower, nowhere. We all just sat there, stunned, as the lift carried us up the mountain. By the time we reached the top, ski patrol was waiting, confused as hell about why we looked like we'd seen a ghost. They swore the lift had only been down for a few minutes. We didn't argue. We didn't say anything. We just unbuckled, strapped into our boards, and rode down in silence, but when I hit the bottom, I couldn't help it. I looked back, up at the tower, and just for a split second, I swore I saw a pair of footprints in the snow, leading away from the base of the ladder. Not up, not down, just away. Like whatever had been up there had stepped off the cable and walked into the trees. I thought I'd finally found the perfect escape. A remote cabin in the middle of nowhere buried in fresh snow and silence. It was supposed to be a week to clear my head, to get away from the noise and chaos of city life. No distractions, no obligations. Just me, the crackle of a fire, and endless white wilderness. The first couple of days were exactly what I'd hoped for. The cabin was cozy, stocked with enough firewood and food to last weeks. I'd sit by the window, watching the snowfall, sipping coffee and reading. It felt like I'd hit the reset button on my life. But on the third night, just as the snowstorm kicked into overdrive, there was a knock at the door. At first, I thought I imagined it. The wind had been howling all evening and the sound seemed to blend with it. But then it came again. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks. My stomach tightened. Who would be out here in this weather? The nearest town was miles away, and the only road leading to the cabin had been completely buried since yesterday. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. A woman stood there, shivering and covered in snow. Her hair was tangled, her clothes soaked, and she clutched her arms to her chest like she was trying to hold herself together. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "My car broke down. I've been walking for hours. I just need to warm up." Her story made sense, but something about her didn't. Maybe it was the way her eyes darted past me, scanning the cabin like she was already making plans. Or the fact that, despite her disheveled appearance, her boots looked almost brand new. But what was I supposed to do? Leave her out in a blizzard? I stepped aside and she shuffled in, collapsing onto the couch near the fire. I handed her a blanket and made her a cup of tea while she rambled about her car, the storm, and how grateful she was for my help. I tried to be polite, but I couldn't shake the unease that crept over me as I watched her. Her movements were jerky, like she was barely holding herself together, and her eyes never stayed on one thing for long. "You're a lifesaver," she said, wrapping the blanket tighter around herself. "I don't know what I would have done." "No problem," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Once the storm clears, we can figure out how to get you back to town." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear something, a floorboard creaking, the faint rustle of movement. Twice, I got up to check on her, but each time she was curled up on the couch, seemingly asleep. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next morning, I woke up to find her standing by the window, staring out at the snow. She didn't notice me at first, and I almost jumped when she turned and smiled. "Still coming down out there," she said, her tone light. "Looks like we're stuck for a while." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, guess so." I made breakfast, but she barely ate. Instead, she wandered around the cabin, picking up random items and asking questions that seemed harmless but felt intrusive. "How long have you had this place? Do you come here often? Do you live alone?" Her tone was casual, but the way she asked made my skin crawl. By midday, things started disappearing. At first, it was little stuff. A spoon, a pair of socks I'd left drying by the fire. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness. but then I noticed one of the kitchen knives was missing. When I asked her about it, she shrugged and said, "Maybe you misplaced it." By the second night, the tension was unbearable. I tried to keep things polite, but every time I looked at her, I felt like I was being watched in return. She barely spoke, and when she did, her words were strange, cryptic. "Snow does funny things to people," she said at one point, staring into the fire. "Makes them see things that aren't there." I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I woke up to find her gone. The couch was empty, the blanket folded neatly at the end. For a moment, I felt relief. Maybe she'd left on her own, found a way back to her car. But then I noticed my boots were missing, along with my keys and 2 more knives from the kitchen. I grabbed my spare boots and stepped outside, hoping to find some sign of her. The snow had stopped and the morning light made the forest look almost peaceful. But as I circled the cabin, I saw them. Footprints in the snow, leading away from the cabin and back into the woods. They weren't hers. They were mine. The prints were identical to the ones I'd left when I went outside the day before, only now they formed a wide circle around the cabin. And there were more of them. Dozens, crisscrossing each other, some leading off into the trees and vanishing. My stomach turned as I realized what they meant. She hadn't left. She'd been out here, walking in the snow, circling the cabin all night. I followed one set of tracks to the edge of the woods, but they ended abruptly, like she just vanished. No sign of struggle, no other tracks leading away, just a smooth, unbroken expanse of snow. When I turned back toward the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the frost-covered window pane, there was a faint outline of a face, smiling, watching. I didn't go back inside. I grabbed my car keys from the emergency stash I'd hidden under the porch and drove through the snow, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. When I told the locals what happened, they exchanged uneasy glances but offered no explanation. The cabin had a reputation, they said, but no one could agree on what that meant. I never went back to that cabin, but sometimes when the snow falls just right, I swear I can see her face in the windows of my apartment, always smiling. You know how every small town has that one urban legend that everyone whispers about but no one actually believes? In my hometown, it was the echo chamber. It was this old, abandoned recording studio on the edge of town that shut down in the 70s after some incident no one would talk about. The building was a crumbling brick eyesore, covered in graffiti and surrounded by chain-link fence. Kids would dare each other to break in, but no one ever stayed long. They said the place had a way of making you hear things you didn't want to hear. I was 17 when I decided to check it out. I was big into music back then, playing in a garage band with my friends, and I thought it'd be cool to film a music video in a legit old studio. Plus, I was bored. It was one of those endless summer nights where the air feels heavy and time just drags. My best friend Jake agreed to come with me, mostly because I promised him free pizza afterward. We waited until dark, then snuck through a gap in the fence. The studio was even creepier up close. The windows were boarded up, and the front door hung open like it was waiting for us. Inside, it was a time capsule, old recording equipment covered in dust, broken mic stands, and walls lined with soundproof foam that was peeling off in chunks. The air smelled like mildew and something else I couldn't quite place, like burnt plastic. We set up our gear in what used to be the main recording room. Jake brought his guitar, and I had my camera. We were just messing around, playing a few chords and filming random shots, when I heard it. At first, I thought it was feedback from the amp, but it was different. A low, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "You hear that?" I asked Jake. He nodded, looking uneasy. We tried to ignore it and kept playing, but the hum got louder, almost like it was reacting to the music. Then something weird happened. My camera started picking up voices. At first they were faint, just whispers buried in the static, but as we played, they got clearer. They weren't saying anything coherent, just fragments of words, like snippets of a conversation. I stopped playing and checked the footage. The voices were there, clear as day, even though no one had been speaking. Jake wanted to leave, but I was weirdly fascinated. I started experimenting, playing different notes to see if the voices would change. They did. It was like the room was tuning itself, zeroing in on something. Then I hit a specific chord, and the room went silent. For a second, I thought it was over. But then, the hum came back, louder than ever, and the voices started speaking in unison. They said my name. I froze. Jake looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. He shook his head. That's when I realized the voices were only coming through the camera. I played the footage back, and there it was, clear as day, a chorus of voices saying my name over and over. But the creepiest part? They didn't sound like strangers. They sounded like me. We got out of there fast. I didn't even pack up my gear, just grabbed the camera and ran. When we got back to my house, I tried to delete the footage, but it wouldn't go away. No matter what I did, the file kept reappearing on the memory card. I ended up smashing the camera with a hammer and throwing it in the dumpster behind the gas station. I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. A few days later, I started hearing the hum again. It was faint at first, like a distant radio, but it got louder every day, and the voices came back too. They weren't just saying my name anymore. They were saying things only I would know. Secrets I'd never told anyone. Memories I'd tried to forget. It was like the echo chamber had found a way inside my head. I tried to ignore it, but it got worse. I'd be sitting in class and suddenly I'd hear my own voice whispering something I'd done years ago, something I was ashamed of. Or I'd be lying in bed, and the hum would start up, drowning out my thoughts. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't think. I felt like I was losing my mind. I went back to the studio one last time, hoping I could somehow undo whatever I'd done. But when I got there, the building was gone. Just an empty lot surrounded by chain link fence. I asked around town, but no one remembered the echo chamber. Not even Jake. It was like it had never existed. The hum and the voices eventually faded, but they never completely went away. Even now, years later, I'll hear them sometimes, usually when I'm alone. And when I do, I can't help but wonder if the echo chamber is still out there, waiting for someone else to stumble in and wake it up. It was supposed to be the perfect end to the day. One last run, just me, the fresh powder, and the fading glow of the sunset over the mountains. The slopes had emptied out, leaving the kind of eerie stillness I usually loved. But that night, something felt different. I ignored it, chalking it up to exhaustion and the creeping cold. The lift operator looked surprised when I slid into the chairlift line. "Last ride," he said, giving me a hesitant nod. I nodded back, and the chair swept me up into the air, creaking slightly as it climbed the steep incline. The sun had almost completely set by then, and the mountain grew darker with every passing second. At first, I enjoyed the silence. The world below me was a sea of white glittering under the faint light of the moon. But as the chairlift climbed higher, the shadows seemed to stretch and shift, like they were alive. I shook it off. Long day, tired legs. I'd been on this mountain 100 times. It was just the usual tricks your mind plays when you're alone in the dark. Halfway up, I started to notice something strange. The lift didn't stop. Not once. No skiers were disembarking ahead of me. No one coming down the hill. The lodge lights at the top seemed further away than they should have been, dim and hazy through the snowfall. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it was fine. The staff was just wrapping up for the night, clearing out the stragglers. Then the snow started to fall harder, thick, wet flakes that seemed to come out of nowhere, blotting out the landscape. My tracks from earlier in the day disappeared in seconds. The lift creaked and swayed under the weight of the accumulating snow, and I tightened my grip on the bar in front of me. "Almost there," I muttered to myself. "Just get to the top." When I finally reached the unloading point, my breath caught. The lodge was dark. No lights, no staff, no skiers milling around with their gear. The chairlift didn't stop moving. It just kept going, carrying me past the station and further up the mountain. My chest tightened as I twisted around in the seat trying to see the lodge through the snow, but it was gone, like it had never been there at all. "Hey!" I yelled, my voice swallowed by the wind. "Stop the lift!" No response. The chair kept climbing higher and higher, the ground below me vanishing into the swirling snow. The only sound was the rhythmic groan of the lift and the distant howl of the wind. I fumbled for my phone, but of course there was no service, no signal, no way to call for help. Panic started to set in. I tried to think logically. Maybe the lift operator had made a mistake. Maybe this was some maintenance route. But then why were there no other chairs? Why was I the only one left? And then I saw it. A shape on the slope below me, barely visible through the snow. It was standing perfectly still, facing the chairlift. At first I thought it was a skier, maybe someone lost like me. But the longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't moving at all. It was just watching. The lift kept climbing. I turned my head, trying to shake off the image, but my heart was pounding now. When I glanced back, the figure was gone. I leaned forward in the chair, squinting through the snow, but there was nothing there. Just white, endless white. And then the chair stopped. The sudden jolt almost sent me tumbling forward. The lift swayed in the wind, creaking ominously as I gripped the bar in front of me. I was dangling in midair, far from the ground, the mountain stretching endlessly below me. "Hello?" I yelled. My voice echoed into the void, lost in the storm. The snow was falling so hard now that I could barely see past the edge of the chair. My hands were freezing, my gloves useless against the biting cold. I needed to get down. Now I looked up at the cable above me, trying to gauge if I could climb along it. That's when I noticed the footprints. Not on the ground, on the cable itself. Small, distinct prints, like someone had walked along the line, heading in my direction. My stomach dropped. I stared at the prints, following their path until they vanished into the darkness above me. The chair swayed again, harder this time, as if something had brushed against it. And then I felt it. A hand on my shoulder. I screamed, jerking forward so hard I almost fell out of the chair. When I turned, there was nothing there, just the empty seat behind me, coated in snow. My breath came in ragged gasps as I scanned the area, my heart racing so fast it felt like it might explode. The lift creaked again, this time louder. I looked up and for a split second I saw a face, pale, hollow, pressed against the cable above me. And then it was gone, disappearing into the storm. I didn't wait. I unstrapped my board and jumped, landing hard in the snow below. Pain shot through my leg as I stumbled, but I didn't stop. I ran, my board clutched in one hand, the snow swallowing my steps as I barreled down the slope. The figure was there again, closer this time, standing between me and the path down. I veered to the left, cutting through the trees, my breath coming in panicked gasps. The wind howled around me, carrying faint whispers I couldn't understand. When I finally reached the bottom of the slope, the lodge was back, lights on, music playing, people laughing inside. I stumbled through the door, shaking and covered in snow. No one even noticed me as I collapsed onto a bench, trying to catch my breath. I never told anyone what happened. I just grabbed my stuff, got in my car, and left. I've been snowboarding my whole life, but I haven't set foot on a mountain since. Because whatever was up there, it wasn't human. Camping in the winter has always been my thing. There's something about the silence, the way the snow muffles everything, that makes the world feel cleaner, solitary, peaceful. This trip was supposed to be like any other. Just me, my pack, and the wilderness. I'd planned a 3-day hike through a remote forest, far enough out that cell service was a joke, and human contact was nothing more than a memory. The first day went smoothly, crunching through the snow, setting up camp under a canopy of bare trees, sipping coffee as the sun dipped behind the horizon. By the second day, I felt like I was in my groove, the cold biting less harshly as I adjusted to the rhythm of the hike. But it was on that second afternoon, as the sun hung low and cast long, skeletal shadows through the trees, that I stumbled across the tent. At first, I thought it was just a patch of color breaking up the monotony of white and gray, bright orange nylon peeking through a layer of snow. As I got closer, I realized it was a fully set up tent, not collapsed or weathered, not abandoned in a rush, just there. The weird part? The snow on top was barely more than a dusting, like it had been pitched maybe a day or two ago. Inside the tent was even stranger. There was gear, good gear, still neatly arranged. A sleeping bag unzipped like someone had just stepped out of it. A stove with a half-empty pot of melted snow. A pack stuffed with clothes, food, and even a wallet. The wallet had ID in it. A guy named Sam. No last name, just Sam. Scrawled on a weathered piece of paper tucked behind his driver's license. But there was no sign of Sam. No footprints in the snow, no trail leading away. Nothing. I called out just in case he was nearby, maybe gathering firewood or something. My voice echoed back to me, bouncing through the trees before fading into the stillness. No answer. By the time I realized how unsettling the whole situation was, the sun was already setting. I debated packing up the tent and heading back to my own site, but something about it felt wrong. It wasn't my stuff, my space. Instead, I left it as it was and headed back to my own tent, about a quarter-mile away. I figured if Sam showed up in the middle of the night, I'd hear him and could help if needed. But that night something woke me. It started subtly, soft crunching in the snow like footsteps. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, but as the sound got closer I realized it was deliberate, heavy, human. I sat up, heart pounding, and unzipped my tent just enough to peek out. Nothing. Just the moonlit forest, shadows dancing across the snow. The crunching stopped. For a moment I thought I'd imagined it. Then I heard my name. It wasn't a scream or a shout, it was soft, almost conversational. "James." The voice carried through the still air, coming from the direction of Sam's tent. I froze. My name. No one knew I was out here, at least no one who wasn't hundreds of miles away. The rational part of me wanted to believe it was just the wind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew better. Grabbing my flashlight and knife, I stepped out of my tent. My breath came out in white puffs, the cold wrapping around me like a second skin. "Hello," I called, my voice shaky. "Sam, is that you?" No response, just silence. I crept toward the other tent, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The snow crunched loudly under my boots, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the tent, I stopped and listened. Nothing. No movement, no voice. Just the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. I crouched down and unzipped the tent. It was empty. The gear was still there, exactly as I'd left it. But the sleeping bag was zipped up now, like someone had crawled inside. My heart raced as I leaned closer, half expecting to find Sam's body. But when I pulled the bag open, it was empty too. Just the faint warmth of residual body heat, like someone had been there moments ago. That's when I heard it again. My name. This time it was closer, coming from the woods to my left. "James." I spun around, the flashlight beam jittering as my hand trembled. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. Felt eyes on me, watching. The voice came again, softer now, almost pleading. "James, help me." I bolted. I don't know what I was running from, but I knew I couldn't stay there. My legs burned as I sprinted through the snow, back to my own camp. I barely noticed the cold biting at my face, the way my breath came in ragged gasps. All I could hear was my name, over and over, echoing through the forest. When I reached my tent, I grabbed everything I could, stuffing my sleeping bag and supplies into my pack without bothering to organize it. The voice was still there, circling me, growing more insistent. "James, don't leave. James, come back." I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs felt like they were going to explode, until the voice finally faded into the distance. When I reached the trailhead the next morning, exhausted and frostbitten, I collapsed against my car. I didn't even bother untying my boots before driving away, leaving the forest behind me. I tried reporting what I'd found. Sam's tent, the gear, the voice. But when the park rangers checked the area, they found nothing. No tent, no footprints, no signs of anyone being there. It was like it had all been wiped clean. To this day, I don't know what I heard or who or what was calling my name. But sometimes late at night, I wake up to the sound of snow crunching outside my window. I moved into 147 Carver Street because it was cheap. No credit check, no references, just a handshake with the landlord, and the promise to pay rent on time. This arrangement was most likely due to all the stories around town about this apartment complex being haunted. I heard it on the news once, but paid it no mind at the time. The apartment was nothing special, just a small one-bedroom with a creaky floor and a window that barely let in any light. I didn't care. I just needed a place to stay. What I didn't know, what no one told me, was that no one stays in this apartment for long. I quickly found out why. The first night, I woke up at exactly 3:12 a.m. to a knocking sound. It wasn't coming from the front door, it wasn't my neighbor, it was inside my apartment. I got up, still half asleep, and followed the sound down the hallway. That's when I saw it. A door. It hadn't been there before. No handle, no keyhole. Just a plain gray door that looked like it had always been part of the wall. The knocking was soft and rhythmic, like whoever, or whatever, was on the other side wasn't in a hurry. I reached out to touch it, but as soon as my fingertips brushed the surface, the knocking stopped. By morning, the door was gone. The hallway was normal again, like nothing had happened. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself I had imagined it. Sleep paralysis, maybe. A leftover dream. But the next night, at 3:12 a.m., it happened again. This time, something was different. There was a shadow underneath the door. A long, thin outline of feet, motionless, standing just on the other side. I backed away, heart hammering, but I couldn't bring myself to look away. And then, without warning, the shadow moved. The third night, I locked my bedroom door. I didn't go near the hallway. I didn't breathe. I just lay there staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to happen again. The knocking started at exactly the same time. Soft at first, then louder, closer, like whoever was on the other side knew I was ignoring it. Then, at 3:33 a.m., the knocking stopped, and I heard my name. A whisper, so quiet I almost convinced myself it wasn't real, but it was. The next morning, I called the landlord. "Has anyone ever reported weird things in this apartment?" I asked, trying to sound casual. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before he sighed. "Look, man, if you're having problems, just break the lease and go." His voice was flat, almost rehearsed. "I'll refund your deposit, no questions asked." My stomach twisted. "So, I'm not the first?" Another pause. Then he said something that made my blood turn cold. "There is no extra room in that apartment." That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room waiting, I don't know why. Maybe I just needed to see it one last time. At exactly 3:12 a.m., the knocking started. But this time, I didn't even have to walk down the hall. The door was already open. Just a crack wide enough to see into pure blackness. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, like something was holding me there. Then, from the darkness, something knocked from the inside. A single deliberate tap. Then a voice. "Found you." By morning, I was gone. My keys were on the counter. My wallet was still on the nightstand. My car was in the parking lot. But I wasn't there. The landlord didn't even list the unit this time. Just repainted the walls, locked the doors, and waited. No one stays at 147 Carver Street for long, because the door always comes back, and the knocking never stops. I wasn't supposed to be out that late. I had stayed too long at my buddy's place watching the game, and by the time I left, the snowstorm had turned into a full-on whiteout. The kind of cold that eats through your jacket, the kind of wind that erases tire tracks within minutes. I should have booked a motel. But home wasn't far, just another 40 miles down the highway, and I knew these roads well, so I figured I could make it. I was wrong. The moment I hit the back roads, visibility went to shit. Snow swirled in every direction, my headlights barely cutting through the wall of white. I slowed down to a crawl, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. Then, out of nowhere, a shape, right in front of me. I slammed the brakes. The car skidded, tires fighting for traction, but the road was solid ice. I veered right, lost control, and crashed straight into a ditch. The impact rattled my bones. The engine sputtered and died. Steam hissed from under the hood. I sat there, heart hammering, my breath fogging up the windshield. Outside, the storm howled. I grabbed my phone. No signal. I cursed under my breath. No way in hell was I getting my car out of there. I needed to find shelter. That's when I saw it. A farmhouse sitting just beyond the trees. A 2-story house with a wraparound porch, the windows glowing a soft yellow against the storm. The kind of place that looked lived in, safe. I pulled my coat tighter and stepped out into the cold. The wind hit me like a wall. My boots sank into knee-deep snow. Every step an effort. The farmhouse wasn't far, maybe 100 yards, but in the storm, it felt like miles. I kept my eyes locked on that warm glow, on the only sign of life in the endless white. When I finally reached the porch, I saw the first problem. There were no footprints. Not on the steps. Not on the porch. Not leading to the front door. Just untouched snow, like nobody had entered or left in a long time. I swallowed hard, teeth chattering. Maybe they just shoveled? Maybe the wind covered the tracks? I told myself anything to justify why my gut was twisting into a tight knot. I knocked. No answer. Another knock. Nothing. I tried the handle. Unlocked. The door swung open silently, revealing a warm, dimly lit interior. And that's when I saw the second problem. The house wasn't empty. Not exactly. The table was set for dinner. 4 chairs, 4 plates, steaming cups of tea still on the table, as if whoever lived here had just stepped away for a moment. A fire crackled in the fireplace. A radio played something soft and old-fashioned in the background. And yet, no one. No voices. No movement. Just that awful, suffocating silence. I hesitated in the doorway. Something was wrong. Deeply, deeply wrong. I should have turned around, should have taken my chances in the snow. But my body was frozen, half from the cold, half from pure, unfiltered dread. Then I heard it. A soft creak from upstairs. I nearly bolted. But the wind outside screamed, rattling the windows. The storm was getting worse, and I knew if I left I'd probably freeze before I found another house. I had no choice. I stepped inside. The warmth hit me instantly, but it didn't comfort me. It felt off, like I had just stepped into a trap. I shut the door behind me and locked it. Not sure why. Maybe to keep something out, or something in. I called out, "Hello?" Silence. Only the fire crackling, the soft hum of the radio. I forced myself forward past the dinner table toward the stairs. The creak had come from up there. I placed my foot on the first step. Then the radio cut out. The house went silent. A beat of dead air. Then, a whisper. A voice I didn't recognize coming through the speaker in a low, static-filled rasp. "He sees you." I ran, didn't think, didn't stop, just ran. I bolted for the front door, wrenching it open so hard it nearly came off its hinges. The cold slammed into me like a truck, but I didn't care. I plunged into the storm, my legs burning as I waded through the deep snow. The farmhouse stayed warm and glowing behind me, like it was waiting for me to come back. I didn't stop running until I saw headlights cutting through the storm. A snowplow crawling up the road. I screamed and waved. The driver pulled over and I practically collapsed against the door. He rolled down the window, face lined with exhaustion. "What the hell are you doing out here?" I turned, pointing back toward the farmhouse. There's a house back there. I think something's wrong." He frowned. looked past me. Then he shook his head. There's no house out there. My heart stopped. I turned back. The farmhouse was gone. Nothing but an endless stretch of snow. No porch, no lights, no footprints. Just the storm. You know that feeling when the world seems too quiet? Like not peaceful quiet, but the kind of quiet that wraps around you. Suffocating, unnatural. That's how it felt that day. I'd hit the slopes early, hoping to avoid the mid-morning crowd. By 10 a.m., though, the place was packed. People everywhere laughing, shouting, snow spraying like confetti. Don't get me wrong, I love the energy, but sometimes I just want the mountain to myself. That's when I spotted it. A narrow trail cutting off from the main run, barely visible through the trees. No signs, no markers, just an inviting stretch of untouched snow. I figured it was a service trail or something. Maybe not officially open, but probably fine. I veered left, weaving through the trees, and the noise of the crowd disappeared almost immediately. It was bliss, just me, the board, and the sound of snow crunching underfoot. But then, the snow started to change. It was pristine, too pristine. No tracks, no evidence of wildlife. Even my own tracks seemed to disappear seconds after I passed, swallowed by the perfect white surface. At first, I told myself it was just the wind or the angle of the slope, but the unease started creeping in. I stopped to catch my breath, planting my board in the snow. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks, but then it came again, clearer this time. Words. Or at least something like words. Too quiet to make out, but just loud enough to send a chill down my spine. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and ridiculous in the vast empty space. Nothing. Just the whisper again, faint and directionless. I shook it off, told myself I was being paranoid, and started riding again. But now, the trail seemed wrong. The trees were closer together, their branches twisted and bare. The snow glistened unnaturally, almost like ice, and the slope seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. No turns, no dips, just a straight, featureless path. And then, I felt it. That unmistakable sensation of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, another rider maybe. But there was nothing. Just the trees, their shadows stretching unnaturally long in the weak winter light. I pushed on, trying to focus on the ride, but the whispers were getting louder. Not words exactly, more like murmurs, overlapping and indistinct like a crowd just out of sight. My heart was pounding now, every instinct screaming at me to turn around. But when I looked back, the trail behind me was gone. No trees, no snow, just an endless white void. That's when I saw the figure. It was just ahead, standing perfectly still in the middle of the trail. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark silhouette against the snow. It wasn't moving, but somehow I knew it was looking at me, watching. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Are you okay?" No response. The whispers stopped. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. The air felt heavier, the cold seeping through my jacket and biting into my skin. I couldn't explain why, but I knew I couldn't stay there. Slowly, I adjusted my board, trying to keep my eyes on the figure as I turned. It took a step forward. That was all it took. I bolted, carving through the snow as fast as I could, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers were back, louder now, and I swore I could hear footsteps behind me crunching in the snow. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. The trail started to curve, the trees blurring past me. For a moment, I thought I'd lost it. Whatever it was. Then, I burst out of the trees and into the open. The lodge was right there, bustling with people, music playing, kids laughing. It was like nothing had happened. I stumbled to a stop, gasping for air. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. One of the staff members noticed me and came over, asking if I was okay. I nodded, muttering something about taking a bad fall. but I couldn't stop glancing back at the trailhead. Except, there was no trail. The spot where I'd veered off was gone, just a solid wall of trees with no sign of an opening. My tracks, my board marks, everything. It was like I'd never left. I tried to brush it off, told myself it was just my imagination or some weird trick of the light. But as I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. And when I glanced over my shoulder just for a second, I thought I saw a dark figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching, waiting. Camping in remote national parks is supposed to be about disconnecting. That's why my friend Jason and I picked this spot. No cell service, no noise, just miles of untouched wilderness. We'd been planning the trip for months, a weekend to clear our heads and just enjoy being off the grid. If only we knew how badly we'd misjudged everything. We arrived at the trailhead late Friday afternoon, loaded up our gear, and hiked deep into the park. It was the kind of place that felt like it hadn't been touched in centuries. Towering pines, dense underbrush, and not a soul in sight. Perfect, we thought. By dusk, we found a clearing near a stream and set up camp. The first night was uneventful. Just a crackling fire, some canned food, and the kind of conversation you only have with your closest friends. The air was cold but refreshing, the stars bright enough to light up the forest canopy. I remember thinking this was exactly what I needed. The next morning, as Jason went to collect firewood, I wandered a bit to explore. That's when I noticed the markings. At first, they looked like random scratches on the tree trunks, deep gouges running vertically, almost like claw marks. But the more I looked, the less natural they seemed. They were deliberate, uniform, and they were everywhere, circling our campsite in an eerie, almost methodical pattern. I pointed them out to Jason when he returned. He shrugged it off, saying it was probably from a bear or something. "We're in their territory," he said. I tried to let it go, but something about the way the marks were spaced, almost like a boundary, stuck with me. The day passed uneventfully, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest came alive with sound. Not the usual chirps and rustles of wildlife. This was different. Low, distant howls carried on the wind, punctuated by what sounded like laughter. Jason and I exchanged uneasy glances, but we told ourselves it was just other campers being obnoxious. Still, I noticed he kept his hunting knife close as we sat by the fire. Then we saw the torches. At first it was just a faint flicker through the trees, barely visible against the encroaching darkness. But as the minutes passed, more lights appeared, weaving through the forest like fireflies. They were too steady to be flashlights and moved too deliberately to be accidental. We sat frozen, watching the distant glow grow brighter, closer. "We should go," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Jason nodded, already packing up his gear. We doused the fire and grabbed our backpacks, trying to move as quietly as possible. But as we stepped into the woods, we realized something horrifying. The torches weren't coming from one direction. They were surrounding us. Panic set in as we stumbled through the underbrush, tripping over roots and brambles in our haste. The glow of the torches was now accompanied by voices, low, guttural murmurs that seemed to echo all around us. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were hunting. We moved faster, our breaths ragged, our footsteps crunching loudly in the dead leaves. Every time we thought we'd put some distance between us and the torches, they'd reappear closer than before. It was like they were hurting us, pushing us deeper into the forest. At one point, Jason grabbed my arm and pulled me behind a fallen tree. We crouched there, our hearts pounding, as the voices grew louder. Through the gaps in the branches, I saw them, figures moving between the trees, their faces obscured by shadows. They carried crude weapons, bows, axes, things that looked like they were made for brutality. One of them stopped just a few feet from our hiding spot, his torch casting flickering shadows across his face. He smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that made my blood run cold. He knew we were there. Jason didn't wait. He grabbed my arm and we bolted, crashing through the forest without any regard for stealth. The torches chased us, their light bobbing and weaving through the trees like predatory eyes. The voices turned to shouts, then to laughter, deep, guttural and chilling. They were enjoying this. We ran until our legs burned, until every breath felt like fire in my chest. Just when I thought we might have lost them, Jason stopped abruptly. Ahead of us, carved into the dirt, was a large circle of the same markings we'd seen on the trees. Inside the circle were bones. Animal, I hoped, but I couldn't be sure. And in the center, a crude effigy made of sticks and fur, its hollow eyes staring directly at us. "This isn't random," Jason muttered, his voice shaking. Before I could respond, a sharp whistle cut through the air, followed by the unmistakable twang of a bowstring. An arrow thudded into the tree next to Jason's head, and we were running again, adrenaline overriding every other instinct. Somehow we made it back to the clearing where we'd set up camp. Our gear was gone, the fire pit dismantled, but we didn't stop. We ran past it, following the faint trail we'd come in on, hoping it would lead us back to the trailhead. The torches were still behind us, but they were slowing, like they knew we were almost out of reach. The laughter faded, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. When we finally burst out of the forest and onto the dirt road leading to the parking lot, we collapsed against the side of Jason's truck, gasping for air. We didn't talk on the drive back. I think we were both trying to process what had happened, to convince ourselves it was just some elaborate prank or a bad dream. But deep down we knew the truth. Those people weren't just trying to scare us, they were hunting us. And if we'd made one wrong move, if we'd hesitated even for a second, we wouldn't have made it out. I haven't been camping since. Back in college, I worked the night shift at the university library. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and was quiet most of the time. The library was this massive Gothic-style building with towering bookshelves, creaky wooden floors, and those old-fashioned rolling ladders that looked straight out of a movie. During the day, it was bustling with students, but at night, it felt like a different world. The kind of place where you could hear your own heartbeat if you listened hard enough. My job was simple: reshelve books, help the occasional late-night studier, and make sure no one tried to sneak in after hours. The only rule was to never, under any circumstances, go down to the basement. It was off limits to everyone, even staff. The door was always locked, and the key was kept in the head librarian's office. I never thought much about it, until the night I found the key. It was around 2 a.m., and I was shelving books in the history section when I heard a faint knocking sound. At first, I thought it was just the pipes, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I followed the sound to the head librarian's office, which was usually locked, but the door was slightly ajar. Inside, the knocking was louder, coming from the desk drawer. I opened it, and there it was. A small brass key with a tag that read, "Basement." I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the boredom or the eerie quiet of the library, but I took the key and headed downstairs. The basement door was exactly where I'd been told it was, tucked away in a shadowy corner of the first floor. The key fit perfectly, and the door creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air was colder down there, and it smelled like old paper and something else. Something metallic. I flipped on the light switch, but the bulb flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the room. The basement was smaller than I expected, just a single room lined with shelves. But these weren't ordinary shelves. They were filled with books that looked ancient, their spines cracked and brittle, their titles written in languages I didn't recognize. I pulled one off the shelf and opened it. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, diagrams, and symbols that made my head hurt just looking at them. I flipped through a few more books, and they were all the same: strange, incomprehensible, and unsettling. Then, I found something that stopped me cold. It was a photo album, but the pictures inside weren't normal. They were wrong. The faces were blurred, the backgrounds twisted, like the images had been taken in another dimension. And in every photo, there was a figure in the background, just out of focus, watching. I slammed the album shut and put it back on the shelf. That's when I heard it, a soft whispering sound like someone reading aloud. I turned around, but the room was empty. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, and I realized it was coming from the books. All of them. The entire room was filled with voices, overlapping and echoing like a chorus of ghosts. I backed toward the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The voices stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, one voice broke through, clear and distinct. It said my name. I don't know how I got out of there. I must have kicked the door open or something, but I ran up the stairs and didn't stop until I was back in the main library. I locked the basement door and put the key back in the desk, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. I thought that would be the end of it. But the next night, I found a book on my cart that hadn't been there before. It was one of the books from the basement, its cover worn and faded. I tried to throw it away, but it kept reappearing, always in a different spot, on my desk, in my locker, even in my apartment. And every time I opened it, the whispering started again. I quit the job soon after, but the book followed me. I tried burning it, burying it, even dropping it in a river, but it always came back. The voices got louder too, and they started saying things about me, about my past, about things I didn't even know yet. It was like the book was feeding on me, pulling secrets out of my mind and turning them into words on the page. I don't know how much longer I can keep it hidden. The book's in a locked box now, but I can still hear the voices, faint and insistent, like they're trying to tell me something. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I see that figure from the photos, just out of focus, watching me from the corner of the room. If you've ever worked as a snowplow driver in the middle of nowhere, you know it's a different kind of lonely. Middle of the night, nothing but the sound of your engine, the wind howling, and the constant scrape of steel against asphalt. You don't see other people, you don't expect to. But that night I wasn't alone. I was clearing Route 19, a long, winding stretch of road cutting through miles of nothing. It had been snowing since before my shift started, and it wasn't stopping anytime soon. Visibility was trash. My high beams barely cut through the wall of white. I had the radio on low, just background noise to keep me from zoning out. Then I saw something. At first, I thought it was a deer, maybe a big piece of debris. It was sticking out of the snow in the middle of the road, and as I got closer, my stomach sank. It wasn't a deer, it was a hand. I hit the brakes hard, the plow grinding to a stop just feet away from whatever the hell I was looking at. My heart was hammering. The hand was pale, fingers stiff and curled, already frozen. The rest of the body was buried under at least a foot of snow. I grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, this is Route 19 Plow Unit. I need immediate assistance. I've got..." And that's when I saw the headlights. In my rearview mirror, out of the swirling snow, two beams of light pierced through. A car, close, too close. I hadn't seen anyone on this road all night. No tire tracks except mine. No way in hell should another vehicle be out here. I turned in my seat, expecting to see someone stepping out. Nobody did. The engine was running, no plates, no movement inside, just sitting there, watching. I radioed again, quieter this time. "I've got a vehicle behind me, no driver, no plates, nothing but static." I turned back toward the body. It was still half buried, fingers outstretched like they had been reaching for something when they went down. The snow had settled just enough to make out a dark coat, part of a face, eyes closed, mouth open like their last breath was still frozen in their throat. I heard a noise behind me, not from the car, from the snow. I whipped my head around, scanning the storm, but there was nothing but wind and white. Still, I knew. That feeling. That deep, primal feeling. I was being watched. I left the truck running, stepped out onto the road, boots sinking into the powder. The wind was relentless, ice biting at my face as I edged toward the body. The second I touched them, I knew. They weren't dead. The body twitched. Their lips barely moved. A single word, lost in the storm. "Don't." And then, the passenger door of the car swung open. Nobody inside. I ran. I slammed the plow into gear and gunned it forward, snow flying as I pushed past the body, over it, tires struggling for grip. My rear view mirror filled with those headlights, still there, still following. The road was empty, but I knew they were still out there, watching, waiting. I never saw the body again, never saw the car, but sometimes, when I'm out on Route 19, long past midnight, clearing the road, I still see headlights in the mirror, and I never stop. I've always been the kind of person who pushes boundaries, especially on the slopes. If there's a sign that says no entry or danger off-piste, it feels less like a warning and more like an invitation. But that day, that was the last time I ever ignored one of those signs. The snow was perfect, fresh powder, untouched, glistening in the sun. It was the kind of day snowboarders dream about. I'd been exploring the backcountry for hours, weaving through pine trees, chasing that rush. The official trails were crowded, noisy. This question mark, this was pure freedom. I didn't even notice the crevasse until it was too late. 1 second, I was gliding down a pristine slope, and the next, the ground gave way beneath me. The fall wasn't as far as I'd feared, maybe 15-20 feet, but it was far enough to knock the wind out of me. When I finally caught my breath and looked up, I realized just how bad it was. The walls of the crevasse were jagged and slick with ice towering above me. My board was wedged awkwardly between two chunks of ice, and there was no way I was climbing out on my own. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no service. My friends were miles away, probably already halfway through their après-ski beers. I shouted for help, my voice echoing off the icy walls, but it felt like yelling into a void. After a few minutes, I gave up. No one was going to hear me out here. That's when I noticed the sound. At first I thought it was the wind, a low, hollow hum, almost musical, like the glacier was singing. But the longer I listened, the more it felt deliberate, rhythmic, like a voice trying to speak through the ice. I shook my head, trying to snap out of it. I was alone, stranded, probably concussed. Of course I was hearing things. But then it came again. Louder. Closer. I sat perfectly still, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. The sound was coming from deeper in the crevasse, from the shadows where the ice turned a deep, suffocating blue. It was a voice, a low guttural whisper, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. The whisper stopped, and then something moved. It was subtle at first, a faint crunch of snow, a shift in the shadows. I told myself it was just the glacier settling, the ice shifting, but as the minutes dragged on, the movements became more deliberate. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing up from the depths. "Hey, is someone down there?" My voice bounced off the walls, but I got no response. Just more footsteps, closer now. I grabbed my board, yanking it free from the ice. If someone or something was coming for me, I wasn't going down without a fight. I held the board like a shield, my eyes locked on the darkness below, and then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a silhouette in the shadows. But as it moved closer, the light from above caught its face, or what should have been its face. The features were blurred, distorted, like someone had tried to carve a human face out of ice and failed. Its eyes were empty sockets, its mouth a gaping hole, jagged and black, and it was smiling. I scrambled backward, the ice cutting into my palms. The thing didn't move fast, but it didn't have to. It just stood there staring at me with that frozen, lifeless grin. I could feel the temperature drop, the air around me growing heavier, sharper. My breath came out in ragged, visible gasps. "Stay back!" I shouted, swinging my board in front of me. The thing tilted its head, like it was curious, and then it started to hum. That same low, haunting hum I'd heard earlier, but now it was right in front of me, vibrating through my skull. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just in the air. It was in the ice, in the ground, in me. I don't know how I found the strength to move, but I did. I turned and started climbing, digging my hands and boots into the ice, desperate to get out. The thing didn't chase me. It didn't have to. The hum grew louder, the vibration shaking the crevasse, making the walls crack and splinter. Chunks of ice fell around me, and I knew if I didn't get out soon, I'd be buried alive. Somehow I made it to the top. I pulled myself over the edge and collapsed in the snow, my lungs burning, my body trembling. I looked back into the crevasse, half expecting to see that thing climbing after me. But it was gone. The hum stopped. The air was still. All that was left was the sound of my ragged breathing and the distant wind. I didn't stick around to see if it would come back. I grabbed my board and hiked back to the main trail as fast as I could, not caring if I looked like a lunatic to the other skiers. When I finally made it back to the lodge, I told my friends I'd taken a bad fall and needed to call it a day. I didn't tell them about the crevasse or the whispers, or the thing in the ice. I don't go off-piste anymore. Not because I'm afraid of falling or getting lost, but because I know what's waiting out there, and I know it's still humming. I'll never forget that hike. What started as a weekend escape into nature with my friends turned into something I still can't explain. Something that's burned into my mind every time I step into the woods. It was me, Claire, and Josh, friends since college. We planned to hike this remote forest trail that Claire found online. It wasn't well known, which was kind of the point. No tourists, no kids running around, just us and the wilderness. We started early, the kind of morning where the mist still clings to the ground and the trees are dripping from the night's dew. The trail was marked, barely. Little wooden stakes painted red stuck in the ground every few hundred feet. It was enough to keep us on track, but the trail itself was faint, more like a suggestion than an actual path. I didn't think much of it at the time. The first few hours were perfect. We were laughing, sharing stories, taking in the fresh air. Josh even joked about how cliché it was to be scared of getting lost in the woods. "We've got GPS, maps, and these handy-dandy red markers," he said, tapping one of the stakes with his boot. "We're practically invincible." I should have known he'd jinx it. Around noon, we stopped for lunch at a clearing. It was beautiful, the kind of spot you'd see on the front of a postcard, with sunlight streaming through the trees and a little stream trickling nearby. But when we got back on the trail, something felt off. The first thing I noticed was the markers, or more accurately, the lack of them. The red stakes that had guided us so far were just gone. At first, we thought we'd missed one, that maybe we weren't paying attention. So we retraced our steps back to the clearing, but even then, there was nothing. No markers, no trail. It was like the forest had swallowed them whole. Claire tried using the GPS on her phone, but the signal was spotty at best. "We're here," she said, pointing to a blank patch on the screen. "Or somewhere around here, I think." The uneasy laughter that followed didn't last long. We decided to keep moving in what we thought was the right direction. The woods were dense, the trees growing closer together as we went. After a while, the silence became oppressive, like the forest itself was watching us. That's when Claire stopped dead in her tracks. "Do you see that?" she whispered. At first I didn't. Then I caught it, a figure, barely visible through the trees, standing perfectly still. It wasn't close, maybe 50 yards away, but something about the way it stood there made my stomach turn. No movement, no sound, just staring. Josh waved his arms, calling out, "Hey, you lost too?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, watching. We didn't stick around. We picked up the pace after that, adrenaline pushing us forward. But no matter how far we walked, nothing looked familiar. The trees all seemed the same, the sun barely breaking through the canopy above. It was like we were walking in circles, but every turn we took only pulled us deeper into the woods. And then there were the figures. At first, it was just the one, then two, then three. Always far away, just at the edge of visibility, like shadows slipping between the trees. They never moved closer, but they didn't leave either. Every time I glanced back, They were there. By this point, Claire was in tears, muttering, "This doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense." Josh tried to stay calm, but I could see his hands shaking. I didn't want to admit it, but I was terrified. My legs felt like jelly, every sound in the woods setting me on edge. As night fell, the figures disappeared, or maybe we just couldn't see them anymore. Either way, it didn't feel like a good thing. We built a fire in a small clearing, the flickering light barely pushing back the darkness. No one wanted to sleep, but exhaustion eventually won out. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the fire had burned low, casting long, eerie shadows around us. That's when I saw it. A red marker, just like the ones we'd followed before. Except this one wasn't on the ground. It was wedged into a tree at eye level directly facing our camp. I woke Josh and Claire and we all stared at the marker in stunned silence. "That wasn't there before," Josh whispered. "I swear it wasn't." We didn't stick around to figure out how it got there. Packing up what little we had, we started walking again, sticking close together. The forest seemed alive now, every creak and rustle sending waves of panic through us. And the figures? They were back, closer this time. I could see the faint outlines of heads, shoulders, arms, always just far enough to keep me guessing. And then Claire screamed. She was ahead of us, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly as she ran back toward us. "It grabbed me," she sobbed. "Something grabbed my arm." I didn't need to see her arm to know she wasn't lying. The terror in her eyes said it all. We didn't wait to find out what it was. We ran, fast, desperately. Eventually, we stumbled onto a dirt road, collapsing in relief when headlights appeared in the distance. The driver, a hunter heading out early, gave us a ride back to civilization. We didn't tell him everything, just that we got lost. He didn't ask questions. To this day, I can't explain what happened in those woods. We tried looking up the trail online, but we couldn't find any record of it. No reviews, no maps, nothing. It was like it never existed. I haven't been hiking since. The thought of stepping into the woods again makes my skin crawl. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I see them. The figures, the shadows, always watching. I was driving cross-country, taking my time, stopping whenever I felt like it. No real destination, just a road trip for the sake of it. Somewhere between Nevada and Utah, I made a mistake. I missed my exit. Not a big deal, right? GPS can reroute. But my signal cut out, so I figured I'd just take the next exit and loop back. That's when I saw it. Exit 43. No town listed, no services. Just a faded green sign with peeling white letters. It didn't even look like an official highway exit, more like an afterthought. I took it anyway. The ramp curved downward into a narrow 2-lane road lined with trees. No lights, no traffic. Just a long, empty stretch of pavement leading into the dark. After about 10 minutes, the trees broke and I saw it. A town. But it was off. There were cars parked along the street, but no people. The diner on the corner had a neon open sign buzzing in the window, and through the glass, I could see plates of fresh food sitting on the counter, steam still rising. A barber shop had the old-school candy cane pole spinning. The gas station had pumps that looked new, and the prices were weirdly low, like decades out of date. It looked lived in, occupied, but it wasn't. I slowed down, rolling past the storefronts, looking for anything that made sense. The streetlights were on. The buildings weren't run down or abandoned. It was like everyone had just left mid-sentence. I kept driving until I saw the motel at the end of the strip. That's when my stomach dropped. My car was already there. Same make, same model, same dent on the rear bumper. Sitting in the gravel lot parked neatly in front of room 6, and the keys still in the ignition. I slammed on the brakes. My car was running, the one I was in, so how the hell was it also there? Then my phone buzzed. No service, but somehow I had a text. Unknown number. Check in. We've been waiting. I nearly threw my phone. My skin went cold, and then I saw them. Silhouettes. In the windows. Not moving, not watching, just standing there. Shapes of people inside the buildings, pressed against the glass, still as mannequins. No faces, no eyes, just waiting. I floored it. Spun my car around so fast I nearly skidded into the curb. I didn't care. I just had to get the hell out. The headlights caught something in the rear view. A man standing in the middle of the road. No expression, no features, just a shape. And as I peeled out, tires kicking up dust, I swore I saw his mouth move. I couldn't hear it, but I knew what he said. "You'll be back." I never found exit 43 again. I tried, for weeks. Drove that stretch of highway a dozen times. No sign, no exit ramp. But sometimes at night when I'm driving alone, I see my taillights up ahead, and my phone buzzes. Check in. We've been waiting.